The easier it is to manipulate us. Just go shopping, we'll take care of it. I vowed then and there in my own world as a travel writer, I want to encourage my travelers to be engaged. You don't make more money off of travelers when they're engaged, but it's a more rewarding work. The average traveler in this industry, it's all about fun in the sun, duty-free shopping, you know, beautiful frequent flyer miles and time on the beach, and what's the power of your sunscreen. None of that is wrong in itself, but if it bullies you out of a thoughtful experience in your travels, a transformational experience, you've lost something. And we need that now more than ever, a transformational experience in our travels, so we come home with that broader perspective. So I'm so thankful that in my work, I'm able to expect my travelers to be engaged. As citizens in your own walk of life, I would encourage you to recognize the importance that we need to celebrate thoughtfulness. We don't want to apologize for being an educated elite. Educated people are what's going to help this country get through some very choppy waters. And that's becoming more and more apparent. When you look at this photograph here haunts me. This is 1932 in Munich. This is a room full of decent German citizens who are shaken up because of the Depression, hurting economically, wishing they had more jobs. They were betrayed by their leaders in their mind when they were quitting the war of World War I before they should have. They called it the stab in the back. They were angry with immigrants and refugees. They had a bombastic, authoritarian leader who was expert in crowd psychology, expert in scapegoating, expert in lies, expert in belittling the media. He told lies that were amazing, but he told them enough and with so much confidence that people embraced it. It's a frightening parallel. It's not a perfect parallel, but in this case, history, it may not repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And we need to learn from it. And there's a lot of thought about that all over the Western world. In Europe, there's a lot of angry, fear-mongering, populist, nationalist movements that are wanting to build walls and to demonize minorities and so on. And it's really just preying on fearful people. And it's dumbing down their societies. And it takes the society down a very dangerous road. So when we look at that, we've got to remember what happened after that, and we've got to understand that history can repeat itself and we can learn from it, and in our travels that is a very healthy thing. A great thing about traveling is you hang out with people you wouldn't normally hang out with when you're at home. I just love going to places where I'm the oddity, where people stare at me. I love to get out of the norm, out of my comfort zone. In your travels, you will meet people that think you're interesting because we are a quirky part of this world. You'll have encounters. I have more interesting encounters with interesting people in a month in Europe than I have for the rest of the year at home. Doesn't need to be earth-shaking encounters. This is just a silly little event for me in Italy. I was I think it was in Naples, and this kid was staring at me. Finally, his dad said, "Excuse my son, he stares at Americans." And I said, "Well, what's with that?" And he said, "Last week we were at McDonald's having our hamburger with the fluffy white bun, and my son, noticing the fluffy white bun, said, 'Dad, why do Americans have such soft bread?' And the dad said, 'Son, it's because Americans have no teeth.'" I don't think the dad meant anything by that. It's just what dads do when they're out with the kids. They say silly things to entertain themselves and confuse the kid. The kid was a little confused. He looked at me and I showed him my teeth to get over that little bit of misunderstanding between people. You'd be surprised how many silly misunderstandings there are between people. And when you realize that, then the more we can connect with each other, the better. When we go over there, it makes it tougher for their propaganda to demonize us. And when we come home, it makes it tougher for our propaganda to dehumanize them. It's people to people. It's a fundamental value of travel. It's a beautiful thing. And in our travels, it's critical that we meet real people, talk to each other, and let us better understand each other. Ireland is one of my favorite places to travel. And I think in part because in Ireland, I have the sensation that I'm understanding a foreign language. I speak only English, certainly nothing to brag about, but I get around pretty well speaking English. But in Ireland, I got this fun feeling that I'm understanding a different language because this is just my theory. In the areas where they speak Gaelic first, that's the West Coast, where they have Gaeltachts, national parks for the preservation of the traditional culture. Imagine that the government actually spends money so small farms can stay in business, so people can still live out the traditional lifestyle, so people in the big city, kids in the big city can go there on summer camp and see from where they came. It doesn't cut the litmus test here, so it wouldn't be worth the money. But in Ireland, they think it's worth keeping the traditions alive that way, so they have their roots. I like to go to these places. They're called Gaeltachts, literally Gaelic-speaking areas, where the traditional culture is subsidized by the national government, and there you meet people who speak Gaelic first and English second. You walk up to these guys, and they're talking to each other in Gaelic, you wouldn't know it, and they turn to you and they speak English, and then you say thanks, goodbye, they turn back into their Gaelic. Now my theory is, they think in a Gaelic template, and they communicate directly, translate directly into English. Consequently, you get that interesting Irish gift of gab and that creative way to converse. And when you're traveling in Ireland, they love to talk. And they're fun to talk with. Beautifully working economic machine. Not that we got to make the pie bigger. You can make it bigger, but it's come with some pretty serious cost. Europe understands what value of life is in their own way. I'll tell you, I'm glad I'm a businessman in the United States and not in Europe. It'd be very frustrating for me to do my work in Europe, but we can learn from them in a lot of ways, and I think this is a challenge for us right now. When we go to Europe, we're going to find that Europeans work hard and they also play hard. It's kind of annoying, but they play a lot. And if you do the arithmetic, as I mentioned, we produce more per person, but by every honest assessment, they produce as much as we do per hour, and they choose to work fewer hours. So you got an option. Just this year it occurred to me, all my life I've been saying the work ethic. It's not the work ethic, unless you're an ethnocentric American that thinks that's right and everything else is wrong. We have a work ethic. Europeans look at us and shake their heads sadly, thinking, what drives you people? You got the shortest vacations in the rich world. You're working yourself frantically into early grave and you don't even use your vacation statistically. What's with us? Well, we're Americans. We got the work ethic. It's a work ethic. I'm walking around here in Amsterdam and I meet these guys, they have fewer kids. So what happens is, a young society, because of that success, becomes an inverted triangle, and you got a relatively few people working, a lot of people living to retirement, and then they just live way too long after that. You can imagine the arithmetic is not there to sustain those lavish entitlements, because not enough people working. So what is the unfortunate lot in life for politicians in Europe today? To stand in front of their workers and say, sorry, we got to change the rules. Your parents had the promise and they retired early. Your friend retired 5 years ago, yeah, but you got to work 5 more years before you can retire. It's baffling people. Brexit is a good example of that. The leader in Hungary was just like our leader, but years before our leader. France has an interesting situation coming up in the next election. Renzi in Italy came up against this and he's out of office. It's fascinating what's happening. There's a lot of frustration, there's a lot of fear of immigrants, there's a lot of populism going on, there's a lot of fear-mongering going on. There's going to be demonstrations. Is it dangerous? Can we go over there safely? I think yes. We took 900 tours around Europe last year, not a single glitch. Refugee situation, does that impact us? No. There's 1 million refugees coming into Europe. It's a continent of 400 million people. It's got a history of absorbing refugees. This is a big wave, but they will absorb them. As a matter of fact, many countries want them to revitalize their workforce as they grow older. They need somebody to do their work. Obviously, if we got rid of all of our refugee workers, our immigrant workers tomorrow, we would want some workers coming in too. Societies need those, what Germans call Gastarbeiters. So it's an interesting time to be traveling, it's an interesting time to learn from each other, and it's an interesting time to pay attention to history. It's not a good time to stay home because you think that's safer. I spent 4 months here in Europe. I've got 100 tour guides. We took 20,000 people around Europe. I'll tell you, when you get to Europe, you're glad you're there. There's a joy in Europe. There's a There's an easiness in Europe that I think is a good reminder. It's a healthy kind of vibe. In our lifetime, the big news has been the end of the Soviet Union and 100 million Europeans who were communist in the Warsaw Pact suddenly becoming capitalists. What an amazing impact. Now, this shot is in Poland, and it reminds me of how Eastern Europe is a festival of pent-up entrepreneurial spirit. This reminds me back, whenever I look at this lot, I think back in the old days during communism, it was so bleak and dreary and demoralizing. If you were lucky enough to own a car in Poland, you took the windshield wipers in with you at night. Why? Because they had this clueless command economy ignoring the basic laws of supply and demand. Somebody upstairs forgot to order windshield wipers, demand exceeds supply, thieves get wind of that, steal your wipers at night, common sense, and sell them on the black market the next morning for a small fortune. That's why black markets work, is because the government is getting in the way of supply and demand. Today, of course, supply and demand is kicking in. There's more than enough wipers distributed and produced in Poland to meet the demand, and people are leaving their wipers on their cars all night long in Warsaw. It's a happy time in Eastern Europe, it really is. You know, I say it's a happy time in Eastern Europe. It's interesting, when you read the news, you know, there's bad news, bad news, bad news. But you've got freedom, you've got double the affluence, you've got an energized young generation, you've got hope. There's all sorts of disappointments that make the headlines, but when you travel, you realize this world is a beautiful place. This world is a joyful place. And I refuse to accept the story that's put on us that it's dangerous out there and that this is a time of dislocation. It's just not true. And with our TV show, we commonly stop and just shake our heads and just think, life is good. Life is good. Of course there's struggles. Of course there's bad guys. But when you think of how many billion people on this planet and how much aggressive economic playing there is, you'd think there'd be more problems than there are. We've got some serious problems to solve, but we are living in beautiful times where we've got media that is messing up our perspectives. I want you to think about that for a minute when you think about fear and so on. Do you remember when we were younger? Some of you probably don't, but I certainly do. And Walter Cronkite said, and that's the way it is. I really believe, to the best of their ability, that's the way it was. They weren't jacking anything up. This is just the news. In the old days, corporations who had media gave to our society the news without needing to make a profit. When they wrote Walter Cronkite's paycheck, they willingly lost money. Since then, corporations have become entities that have a legal obligation to profit maximize to their shareholders in the short term. In other words, media corporations cannot give us the news without making money on it. The downside of that is it makes us a fearful society, because it's all measured in how many eyeballs do you get. And if you're not having enough eyeballs, you can't charge enough money for your advertising to pay your good-looking anchor people, and you got to jack it up. It's got to be more crisis, more sex, more blood, more hysteria. Now, a lot of people can see it as entertainment. I'm a little bit sophisticated when it comes to media, and I like commercial news because it's entertaining. But I'm not going to let it make me a fearful person. But the average American is made fearful by entertainment masquerading as news. And when you think about news having to be entertainment to be profitable, and you think of the consequence of that with a jittery populace, and you think of the vested interest they have in having a crisis so everybody can tune in, and then you think of it in a 24/7 context, it's one big crisis all the time. And people who are less sophisticated are wigging out. And we got to build walls, and we got to have law and order, and we got to have more military. It's a very interesting dynamic that we've got ourselves into. And if we all just got away from the TV a little bit, and if we all just traveled and humanized the other 96% of humanity a little bit, we'd go over there and play in the fountains in Warsaw and realize that there's a lot to be thankful for and celebrate on this beautiful planet. Now, when we go to Europe, for me, the joy of Europe is the cultural diversity. As I mentioned, Europe is uniting now. There's no borders. Everybody's got the same coins jangling in their pockets. Everybody's speaking English. You'd think it's going to become homogenous, just strip malls every part of the country, like in our area, where it's always the same. But the interesting, counterintuitive result of the unification of Europe is more ethnic diversity instead of less. And let me explain why. There are 3 loyalties if you're a person in Europe: region, nation, and Europe. If you ask a person in Munich, where are you from? He might say, I'm Bavarian. Or he might say, I'm German. Or they might say, I'm European. Ask somebody in Barcelona, where are you from? I'm Catalonian. I'm Spanish, or I am European. If you look at any city hall in Europe these days, you'll find 3 flags: the region, the country, and Europe. Scotland, Britain, and Europe. Now, in our lifetime, the headlines have been filled by regions challenging nations, right? Basque people challenging Madrid. They want to break away. They want to teach their kids to speak Basque, and they can't do it because that threatens Spain. You've got people in Brittany threatening Paris. When I first traveled in Paris, in France, when I was a kid, I remember in Brittany, if you named your child a Celtic name, that child would not have French citizenship. They wouldn't get a passport. That's unthinkable today, but Brittany really challenged France back then. And of course, Ireland and Scotland have long challenged London.